Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Stanford Biodesign Alumni webinar. This is a chance for you to get feedback and experiences from alumni who have been through the program already. So it's always a high value, high information event. So hope you enjoy it. I'm joined by Vic McRae, Janine Forch, Sandy Ruggles, and we'll get Shreya Mehta on here in just a second. And they'll be introducing themselves, talking about their experiences today. They're going to address some pre-formulated questions and then talk about some popular topics that we all get questions on about the program. After that, we'll offer a live Q&A session where you can type in your questions and they will answer as many as they can within the hour. This will last 60 minutes. And so you can start typing your questions in right away. Someone will be monitoring those and collecting them as we go. So without further ado, this also, I should say, will be recorded and posted on our website tomorrow if you weren't able to catch the live session. So we'll get started right away, and I'll turn the time over to Vic.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you all for joining this webinar. We're going to start with just some quick introductions around the panel table here. So with that, Janine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, absolutely. I'm Janine Forch. I completed the fellowship in 2016 to 17, and I am now a clinical assistant professor of neonatology at Stanford, and additionally the chief medical officer of the startup that we started out of biodesign called Cadence, and it's a women's health company.
Thank you, Janine. Sandy?
Hi guys, I'm Sandy Ruggles. I'm a fellow from 2009-2010, and I have been, well, these days I have a consulting practice in with early stage medical device companies around business strategy and product design.
Thank you, Sandy. Shreya?
Yeah, so I was a biodesign fellow 2013, 2014, and founded a company out of the biodesign fellowship called ZenFlow, and currently I'm the chief technology officer for ZenFlow, and I have a bioengineering background.
Thank you, Shreya. Again, I'm Vic McRae. I completed the fellowship in 2010, 2011, and am a general and trauma surgeon by training and practicing part-time with my full-time job as CEO of our startup out of biodesign called Tangible Science, which is a contact lens company. So with that, the panel will address a number of common questions while the attendees continue to send in their more specific questions. I'm hoping that we can address a few of the questions that we know we had when we were applying to biodesign. And so we'll start with Sandy asking the question, how did you decide to apply to the fellowship?
Sure. So I had both an interest in medical device and a personal connection into the fellowship. So my undergraduate roommate had been a fellow the year before me. And I was at a point in my career where I had started a startup company, and I had been there enough years to feel like we had really had an impact, but was feeling restless about what I wanted to do next, and looked at the Biodesign Fellowship as a potential way for me to really hop into the business aspects of technology and to get closer to the physician who would be using the product. I was in biotech before I came to biodesign, and I felt really disassociated from both the patients and the physicians that we were trying to create products for.
Thanks, Sandy. Shreya, same question. What made you make the decision to apply to biodesign?
Yeah, so I have engineering background as well as regulatory background. So when I decided to apply for the fellowship, I was actually working at FDA as a lead reviewer. And the reason why I decided to apply to biodesign is because I wanted to sort of diversify my experience in medtech and understand a little bit more about the different facets of, creating a successful medtech company, including, issues like reimbursement and IP. And I think biodesign, allowed me to get kind of a more holistic view of all those different nuances.
Thanks, Shreya. Janine, same question.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a physician, so I was in a little bit different place. I had finished my pediatrics residency and thought that I would never go to a biodesign fellowship. One of my closest friends did, and I thought that's what she did, and that this just really wasn't for me. So I have a very atypical approach to how I ended up in biodesign. And it really started to change my career. So when I was in fellowship, I realized that the research that I was doing really lent itself very well to device development, and that I was actually developing devices, but had no idea about where to take them after I wrote a research paper, but really wanted to impact patient care and wanted to understand what that trajectory looked like. So I went to the fellowship to understand the process a little bit better, to get a background in regulatory, as well as just understanding what needs really led to successful companies and were impactful for patients.
Thank you, Janine. I'll answer the same question. And in very similar to Janine, I got interested in medical devices during my residency in surgery as I began to use more devices and see the benefits that devices could have on my delivery of care to patients. And at the same time began to have my own ideas for devices, but realized that I didn't know anything about what to do with those ideas. Program, I thought it would be a great opportunity to learn about the medical device development process to determine if any of the ideas that I've been having the ones worth working on. And it was my decision to apply to the program, and I made the decision to complete residency before applying for the program. So moving on to the next question, we all applied and got into the program, obviously. And I'm sure the four of us had a variety of different experiences throughout the Biodesign Fellowship year. What I want to touch on now is identifying what the true highlights of the year were for each of us. Janine, maybe you can start by telling us the highlights of your year.
Sure, it's pretty general, but I really think that the fellowship does something that you don't get in medical training. It really is a different type of team building that I really enjoyed. A lot of my teamwork happens to be in a very hierarchical structure, which works for medicine, but doesn't necessarily work for device development. I was in neonatology. We don't have a multitude of devices as there are in a lot of other fields like surgery and cardiology, et cetera. So it was really nice to finally work with engineers to solve clinical problems that I see every day, mostly because we have companies and engineers that design things for neonates but are completely inappropriate for them. A lot of companies see babies as smaller adults and smaller children, which they actually need completely different solutions. So it was nice to be able to really work with the engineers and help them understand the entire process and help them understand what we needed as physicians and what our patients needed and what their specific issues were as well. So I think that was probably the best part that still continues to this day. And I love the different perspective that the engineers on our team brought that I wouldn't have been able to create myself because I do not have an engineering background.
Thanks, Janine. Sandy, same question. What were some of the highlights from your year?
Sure. So coming as someone from a technical background, I really just loved the immersion into the hospital setting. That the fact that when you are not a medical provider, you just don't have that inside view into the way the medical system works, with the exception of being a patient. And so it was free reign of the hospital to go and look and uncover and discover so much about how a hospital and a medical system work, and finding and uncovering all these patient populations that are underserved by the way that medicine is delivered today. It just was incredibly invigorating towards designing solutions.
Thank you, Sandy. Shreya, same question.
Yeah, it's actually similar to Sandy's. I mean, I think the having some experience in the medical setting, even having designed medical technology before, it just gives you a totally different perspective to understand as a technical person when you have the boots on the ground and you understand what's going on. The one thing I would tack on to that is also learning more about venture capital. That's one thing that I didn't have any insight into as an engineer, or obviously on the regulatory side, just kind of what venture capitalists are looking for, what, and hand in hand with that, to be quite frank, is just kind of what drives value. And then that helps you understand a little bit better how you can create successful technologies that are, you can actually bring onto the market, because you'll have capital that you can put to work to make that happen.
Thank you, Shreya. Myself, I think the highlight of my year was, as a physician, being surrounded on a team with people that thought very differently than I did, which really taught me how to take a step back from what I'd learned in medical training and begin to look at problems from very different perspectives, from a scientist perspective, from an engineering perspective. And it really showed me how many biases I had, developed because of my medical training. And I think that was a critical thing to recognize and then figure out how to work through. And the team of engineers and scientists that I worked with were really pivotal at allowing me to do that. So that was, by far the best experience that I had during that year.
Do you want me to jump in with a question?
Sure, absolutely.
I think we're getting a lot of questions about what kind of background do you need and do you recommend before joining the fellowship? One, to be eligible, and then also how to get the most out of it. It's asked specifically towards the MD aspect of things, but I think it would be great to hear from both engineers and physicians what background was helpful, or have you seen be helpful to make the most use out of the program. Sure, I'll start. So I was a fellow, and when I applied and then I was finished, one of the things that I liked about being in that position was that I could decide to continue on to clinical practice as an attending physician, or I could choose to leave my training because it was completed. And the doors were kind of wide open. That being said, there are plenty of people my year and many before that have done the fellowship in the middle of their residency and done just fine and decided to either go back to practice or to leave clinical practice and to join a startup as well. So it kind of depends on where you're at and what you're thinking in your training. I can't speak a lot to what you need to be eligible, but I do think that the more experience you have, the more you'll be able to get out of the fellowship. But that experience ranges a variety of different avenues, whether that's as an entrepreneur, as a clinician, as a researcher. There's not a cookie cutter criteria and one size fits all. It really is who you are as a person and as an innovator.
Great. Maybe I'll give my 2 cents from a second MD perspective. I think the main characteristic, as Janine mentioned, there are a variety of characteristics that fellows come into the program with. I think the main characteristic in common is that all of the fellows come into the program with a desire to create technology to help people. And everyone approaches that from a different perspective, and everyone brings different tools to solving that problem. But that's kind of the thing that we all have in common. In order to do that, I think there are certain traits that are helpful. Creativity, obviously teamwork, specifically for this program, but also for medical device development in general, and just a general open-mindedness as an approach to solving problems. I think are some of the characteristics that I find really helpful. Sandy, do you want to weigh in from a non-MD perspective? How about Shreya?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think just to tack on to what Vic said, an ability to kind of question the status quo. And I think that's one characteristic that's really important. And yeah, and I agree that I think because it's a training program, I think there's a lot of potential to learn the things that you need to learn. I think it helps when you have a little bit of insight into how medical technology comes to market. And that's why I think generally the program likes to have people who have at least a few years of experience as working professionals. And I think that having that a little bit of insight into how into how the field works is a helpful start, especially if you have the end goal of trying to start a company out of the fellowship.
Well, we all talked about, some of the great things about the program and some of the highlights of our year. But it's also a challenging year, to be honest. And there are a lot of challenges that we all have to face during the Biodesign Fellowship year. Let's go around the panel and talk about some of the things that we found the most challenging about the year. Shreya, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think, perhaps what I've found most challenging is, and was able to work around, fortunately, but what I found most challenging is just working with a multidisciplinary team. Most of my life, to be quite frank, I worked with a lot of engineers, and so, it was a different challenge to have a physician perspective and somebody with, business background, and just working with a team that was multidisciplinary. You come to realize people approach problems a little bit differently, and it was actually a really helpful exercise, because obviously they're once you start a company, you have to be able to work with physicians, engineers alike, and people from different backgrounds.
Great. Sandy, how about yourself?
Well, I think for me, the biggest challenge of the fellowship was really on a personal level. I came in as a mom of 2 kids at the time. My daughter was 1 when I started the fellowship. And it was not so much a balance question, because we had a daycare and everything worked out, but it was more a partner balance question. So I needed to really lean on my husband, because I wanted to on the fellowship. I wanted to be at the hospital late. I wanted to be working with my team. And we had to, and we did it before I started the fellowship, but we really had to come up with a plan for how we were going to manage something that was necessarily going to take a lot of my time when we had a lot of responsibilities at home. And I think we did a pretty good job of it. I would leave at 5:30 at night and go home, and then I would Skype with my team again later in the evening if we needed to get together. We often created task lists so that everybody could go off and do their own thing in the evening, but they were still getting, if they needed to get work done, there was still work getting done. I know it was an interesting contrast to the other team, who had a tendency to stay late and be at the university till later in the evening hours, but didn't tend to take their work home with them. So, I think for me, it was a question of balance, but it was also something that I knew coming in that I was going to have to set up, and something that I negotiated, like all of these things, you negotiate them as well as you can as you go. And frankly, I had a great time doing the fellowship, and I learned a ton. So you get out what you invest.
Sandy, Janine, same question.
I think the truthful answer is that the biggest challenge of our fellowship year was really working through some challenging team dynamics that I hadn't experienced before. Because when you do put 4 people together working that intensely for a real common goal, it brings up different personalities and different tensions. We do have a psychologist that is part of the program that works with us every other week and is available all the time to help you work through those things. But I also think it's just a really good life lesson of how to work on teams that you don't dissolve, that you actually continue to forge through and work with. But the other more personal biggest challenge really was deciding what to do afterwards. I know that's coming up as a question from the group, especially since I had finished fellowship and I was trying to decide, do I take a job at Stanford? Do I do locum work and still do med tech things on the side, or do I just go full on into this company? And I definitely took a hybrid approach. I consult for multiple medical companies in the neonatal space, while also being involved in our startup part-time and being a professor at Stanford, which is busy and crazy, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But the problem is that the fellowship opened up so many doors and opened up my mind to thinking so differently about things that it was challenging to figure out which path to go when I had invested so much time and energy into becoming a physician.
Thank you, Janine. I would say the two biggest challenges I faced during my year was one, I would echo what Janine and others have said about the team dynamic. Coming from medicine, which is a very hierarchical type of structure, working on a team where there is no hierarchy and having to still make decisions and move projects forward was a bit of a challenge for me, quite honestly. I think the other challenge was that I was, I had just recently finished a surgery residency and didn't want to lose my surgical skills and techniques over that year. So I had the challenge of how to get through a 10-month program, but still keep up with my medical training. So I ended up, working in some hospitals on the weekends, which became, a scheduling challenge for me, but was manageable in the end. So, moving on, Janine, any questions that we should field at this point?
Oh,
you're on mute.
Sorry. I think we should just go on with the next question because some of them will fall in later.
Okay, sounds great. So switching gears a little bit, I'd like us to discuss what each of our career aspirations were before biodesign and how the biodesign program changed those aspirations into what our aspirations are now. Shreya, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting question for me because I actually didn't have any ambitions of being an entrepreneur when I got into the program. As I mentioned earlier, my perspective was into getting into the program was a little bit more educational. I wanted to use the program to learn more about med tech as an industry and all the different nuances to it. And then, started biodesign and I think the reason why my mentality shifted a little bit is because I think partly because of the fact that we got so much insight into various clinical needs. And once you see firsthand that, patients are suffering and that these are real problems, they're not just, the things on the whiteboard as an engineer you might be trying to solve. I felt compelled at that point to solve the problem. And then so, once you see that firsthand, it drives your motivation. At least it drove my motivation differently. And so, decided to become an entrepreneur just by virtue of wanting to solve this problem. So biodesign was pretty pivotal for me to make that shift, that mental shift and an actual shift in my career path.
Thank you, Shreya. Janine, same question.
Sure, we're getting a lot of great questions coming in, so keep them coming. We'll get to those just shortly. I also had no ambitions of working in a startup or starting a company, and I really just wanted to understand how I could take the ideas that I had and hand them to a company, and that dramatically changed for me. I, throughout the process, realized that I actually could start a company and that this wasn't something that was so far-reaching for me. And then I truly, and my co-founder fell in love with the need. She's an engineer, and we really thought that we were one of the best people to solve this need. And so once we did that, and once we knew that we wanted to fight for this in women's health, we decided that that's what we were going to do. I, at the same time, realized that I still really did love academic medicine, and that throughout researching each of the neonatal needs that we came up with, which we did not end up pursuing, I realized that in my fields, the problem, and one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of medical device companies interested, isn't necessarily that it's just a small field, but it really, there are a lot of significant research gaps that I knew that I could fill. And understanding the needs-based process and being able to teach that to other people was very important to me, as well as realizing where the gaps were and how I could work to fill them and really start to drive innovation in neonatology in general. So that was all really important to me. And I always have the door open to potentially leave for industry or continue to be involved in industry. And I've really enjoyed the mentorship that I've done being a medical advisor for various companies that have gone through the biodesign process as well, that need a physician to give perspective for neonatal problems, which I feel very passionate about. And that's very easy for me to do. And I feel like I have a value and a different perspective that I didn't have before.
I think for me, before residency, never would have thought of starting a medical device company or working in med tech at all. And once I completed the biodesign fellowship, I realized how many other options there were for physicians in particular to work in med tech. And now my full-time job is my startup with myself only operating part-time. So biodesign completely changed my career trajectory, and I'm quite certain that for the rest of my career, I will always have some sort of career involved.
Not to interrupt, but I'm wondering if one of us is typing that's making it a little hard to hear Vic for the rest of the people.
Perfect.
Sounds good. I think the attendees are saying that as well. All better.
Perfect. With that, I think we should just, move on to fielding questions from the participants.
For sure. There's one question that says, what's the average age of the fellows? I think this person probably thinks they have too much experience. They have a PhD and have been working in the med device company for almost 6 years. I'll throw that one out there to whoever wants to answer.
So there are no age limits to the Biodesign Fellowship. However, the fellows typically have a bit of industry or medical practice experience before doing the fellowship. The average probably ranges between 3 and 8 years of industry experience for the non-physicians. So that's more of the norm than someone coming immediately out of their postgrad.
I agree with that. One of the other question touches on what if you're straight out of like undergrad bioengineering training? Would this be a time to apply for the fellowship? And is there anyone who doesn't have postgrad or PhD work under their belts? And I would say there definitely have been people come through that have just had a bachelor's degree and haven't had additional master's degree, but typically those people have had more work experience as well, and then bring their experience in industry to the fellowship. Specifically, even my co-founder has a bachelor's degree, but had about 4 years of industry experience as well. So I think that's very beneficial to have before you come to the program. But I wouldn't want to discourage anyone if you have a unique background from applying, because it could be very attractive to the people selecting, but also you could bring a lot to the table that you aren't even certain that you would be bringing.
Great. Thank you, Janine. And Sandy, welcome back.
Thanks. I had to switch to my phone.
It's great now. So perhaps, Sandy, as we've started fielding questions from the audience, but I think it would be valuable to hear your perspective on how the biodesign program changed your career aspirations from before and after the program.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I had a pretty interesting trajectory both before and after. So I came to biodesign having already founded a company. I started a biotech company out of my PhD at UCSF, and I had been there about 6 years. And one of the things that I really wanted to use the fellowship to do was to transition in a couple of different ways. I was trying to transition away from being a bench scientist into the more interesting and exciting things that I had done as part of a startup, right? Where you have to fill a lot of roles, and you get to think about strategy, and you get to think about future directions of the company, and you get to work on so many more of the business elements of the technology that you're trying to take forward. And so I was wanting to move away from the bench and into strategy, and I was also wanting to move closer to patients and physicians. And so I felt like moving out of biotech and into medtech was a way to do that. So coming out of the fellowship, I did two different things. First, I took a role with Johnson & Johnson at their operating company called Acclarent, which was local in Menlo Park, as a strategic marketing manager. So I switched both into the business side of medtech, and I joined a large company so that I would learn the quality systems, so that I would learn how a large company thinks about quality and product design and all of the different elements that go into bringing a product to market. The experiences I'd had at a startup told me that there's a lot of different ways that you can run a project, but that there's not a lot of ways that you can be successful at a project. And so I really wanted to learn more of the rigor that came from a large company. So that's what I used. I had used the Biodesign Fellowship as a way to transition in two different ways, right? Both into strategy and from a small company to a large company.
Great. Thank you, Sandy. Janine, other questions that we're getting from participants?
Yeah, there's some quick ones and then some detailed ones about the program. So just to clarify, there's one question that says, is the 3 to 8 years of industry experience, I presume someone's reading that on the website, pre-fellowship typical for MD trained fellows? And to clarify, MDs don't necessarily need to have industry experience. We're talking about people who come straight out of undergrad to then have industry experience or additional degree experience. So people usually come out of undergrad and have some industry experience, or they go on to a PhD. They may finish a PhD and have PhD postdoc experience or industry experience. And then physicians, typically they have the path of residency and plus or minus fellowship. So it isn't necessary that, and most MDs don't have industry experience as well. Most of them are still in their clinical training. Anything to add to that?
No, I'd agree completely with you. I think, it can be an asset if you're a physician and you have actual practice experience, but the industry experience is typically more on the engineering or scientist side as opposed to the physician side.
And then some of the next questions are technical. I think this is an important one to clarify because they came up a couple of times. What is the duration of the program? I can quick speak to this one. It is a 10-month program with one of those months being an externship. And I thought maybe we could each talk about our externship experiences. I won't talk too much about it because I actually had a special circumstance where I was working at Stanford, so I got to go back and work at Stanford and still work on our startup. So that's less exciting than I'm sure what other people did. In my program, a lot of people did international work and worked for VCs as well.
So I can jump in there if you guys want. I did my externship with NEA, which is one of the local large and well-respected venture capital firms. And so I spent about a month working with them, looking at both a topic area that they were interested in investing in and doing some market analysis for them, as well as sitting in on and being part of their evaluation of companies that were coming in looking to raise capital from them. And so I found that a really revealing externship for myself, because I had been on the other side of the table. I had raised money from venture capitalists, and I had always kind of thought, oh, maybe I want to go do that. And I got into that world and realized I want nothing to do with it. And so it was quite a good externship in that sense. I really learned where I was interested in going and what I was not interested in working on.
So I did my externship at a mid-stage startup company called Vibrant, which was working in the surgical obesity space. And I selected that externship because I'd never worked in a startup environment and was curious as to what that was like, because I did have an interest in potentially working in a startup after biodesign. So this was a really good month to kind of jump into a startup that was at a really good stage and get a feel for what that environment was like. Shreya?
Well, we can go on to the next question, and if Shreya is able to answer that one, she can jump in a little bit. This is definitely a question that's very core to the biodesign process, so I'm glad someone asked it. Can you touch on the need finding aspect of the program? Was the process challenging, or were the needs evident and vivid?
I can hop in on that one. So, there's a challenge every year to find as many needs as possible. And so you typically find over 200 within your 4 to 6 week immersion within the hospital. And I think just like any good brainstorming exercise, there are some that immediately strike you as really meaty and important and potentially have a long runway, and others that you just see and you think to yourself, well, I'm going to write it down and then we might think about it more. And still others where they're small, but you see them and you keep finding them and you just keep uncovering them. So, you find needs of every type, and part of the process is also learning to refine and dig into the first observations that you make to uncover the needs that are there. Some are really obvious and some take some digging.
So I would agree that the needs are surprisingly plentiful, and coming from the medical field, working in the hospital all the time, I thought one of the most interesting aspects of the need finding process was once I learned how to step back from thinking about needs as a doctor and was able to just kind of observe, it was easy to find problems and needs in the hospital. Our team developed over 300 needs in that 4 to 6 week period. So the needs are there. It's just a matter of training yourself how to identify them, and in some ways getting out of your own way of identifying.
Sorry, I missed my slot to answer. I'm back now. So I wrote actually a response to this question on the chat box here, but I think that in general, what our team found was really difficulty in finding solutions and a viable business model, not so much finding the need. I think if you go into clinical observation with your eyes wide open, there are plenty of clinical needs to be observations to be made, and then clinical needs to be fixed. It's the solution and business model part of it that is challenging. And one thing that we heard from faculty is, in fact, there were a lot of teams who a lot of times year after year, teams would identify the same need over and over again, because some of them are painfully obvious, and then end up not pursuing a solution because they couldn't find a distinguishing insight or anything like that. And sometimes there are reasons why they haven't been pursued before.
Absolutely. I would agree with all of those comments. And I think that as physicians, especially, we're really good at finding all the problems in our environment and not so great at finding the really significant ones that actually make a difference to patient care or could actually allow you to make a solid startup that makes the most impact. So the biodesign process really helps you filter those out. And I look at needs very, very differently now. People bring a lot of needs to me, and I can more easily filter them through to say, oh, that one doesn't seem like it has the weight, or you need to look into this area a little bit more to see if that's valuable. I'd also add that the needs sometimes that didn't seem like they had a lot of weight to them ended up being very meaty, and the things, you might be surprised at what need you end up on and which one really gets through the entire filter process by the end. So I think it's a little bit more nebulous, the one that you choose, but there's plenty of evident and vivid needs.
Janine, there's an interesting question that came through that I think might be worth spending a little time on.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question that asked, several of us have mentioned that there were challenges with the team dynamic. How did we overcome those challenges during our fellowship year? Shreya, any insights that you can share?
Yeah, I think someone had mentioned this. I think it was you, Vic, but there is a psychologist who you meet with once a week as a team to discuss any potential issues. I think that, and this has been brought up before, the sort of flat hierarchy of the team makes things a little bit challenging. But I think that what's great about biodesign is having the meeting once a week allows you to kind of put it all out there, to be honest. It allows you to be kind of emotionally candid, so to speak. And I think that proves to be, it's a good platform to be able to discuss some issues you may not otherwise feel comfortable discussing in a work environment. And I think that's how we overcame our challenges, is just being a little bit more candid with a good platform to be able to do that.
Sandy, your thoughts?
I think the fellowship directors are really aware of what are maybe pretty common places that the fellowship teams have challenges. So it's very common towards the end of the fellowship, especially if not everyone is going to be taking the project forward, to have a lot of discussions around how to value and divide up what was created during the fellowship. And so the fellowship directors are clear with you from the very start that at the beginning of the fellowship year, you need to have those kind of candid discussions about what your goals are out of the fellowship, who really thinks they may be planning to stay with a product further, who is absolutely sure they're moving on to something else at the end of the fellowship, and at least setting some guidelines for how you'll make the decisions moving forward. Our team didn't have a lot of problem or I call it like stress and team dynamic issues. We were really candid with each other and set ground rules at the very beginning. And we were pretty good about being open. I'd say, if anything, our tough discussions actually came towards the end of the fellowship. And by then we had such a strong and pretty trusting relationship established with each other that when we started dividing up projects, when we started going in individual directions, it felt like a natural extension of where our interests had been, rather than a real significant break of the group in some way. We did end up pursuing I'd call it 2.5 projects into the end of our fellowship year, one of which went forward, but the other two we really wanted to chase down, and we thought might have some real potential to them as well. And so we naturally did split into some smaller groups and split up our time on our projects based on our interest areas.
Thanks, Sandy. Janine, your thoughts?
Our team needed to do a lot of drinking, to be totally honest. They suggested we go to the bar frequently, which we did. But in all reality, that actually helped us all chill out a little bit. And we had lots and lots of discussion over long periods of time about what our expectations were. And then they changed, and they really did. And so 3 of us ended up taking one project forward, but then one person decided they needed to go and move to be with their significant other, which we completely understood and kind of expected. And then another person had to move internationally. And then I went back to clinical practice. So we all did things that we didn't necessarily set out to do. But I think a real open line of communication really helped us all get there.
So I'm glad Janine was the first one to say that, because our team did the exact same thing. Every week, our team went to the bar for a happy hour. And I think what that did was it allowed us to develop an actual personal relationship with each other, built on respect and friendship, that allowed us to work through the challenges when we disagreed during the fellowship about work. Because we knew that we could disagree and express our opinion in a respectful way, without compromising the friendship that we developed through our socializing. The team psychologists also helped. They helped us to develop the tools to better communicate with each other, and to talk about things before they became big issues, and address them while they were smaller. So those are things that helped during our year.
I'm going to answer a couple of questions quickly and then punt one over to you guys. So how large are the teams and how are they formed? The teams are generally nowadays about 4 people, and there are 3 teams of 4. How they're formed is a bit of a mystery. They're formed following your interviews, but they really try to find complementary personalities as well as experience levels to form the teams. And you don't choose them, they're chosen for you. But they put a lot of thought and effort and energy into that formation. And the other question talks about, is it evenly split between doctors and engineers? My perspective on that would just say not necessarily. There are physicians, there are engineers, and there are often people with business backgrounds that complement the teams. And so it's really about the additional skills that each person brings to the team and how they can completely form a team that is able to take the greatest advantage of the biodesign process. Shreya, I have one for you. During the fellowship, how much experience did you get working with FDA or other notified bodies?
So we didn't, we didn't work with FDA specifically on our projects, but we did get, consultants, and actually one FDA representative come and lecture us about regulatory processes, who we were able to get a little bit of feedback from on our potential projects. I think that most of the projects are still kind of at their infancy during the biodesign program. So I would say that there's a limited amount of detailed regulatory feedback that makes sense. It's generally a little bit higher level strategy that you're generally discussing during the fellowship in terms of regulatory. Yeah.
This is one question that maybe Vic, you can answer. I think it's an important one though. So what resources are provided for starting your business at the end of the fellowship, and does the program provide some seed funding?
So the Biodesign Fellowship does not provide seed funding. However, they do make a number of introductions to investors and incubators that you can reach out to when it comes time to start your business, that might help with those capital requirements. And even to this day, we still reach out through the Biodesign Network to gain introductions to investors. So that's a huge leg up, although it's not actual capital provided by the program.
And then Sandy, the one for you. What about intellectual property? Are fellows provided with the backgrounds on how to protect their inventions?
Oh, absolutely. So the spring, in the fellowship itself, during the spring, you go through the latter part of the biodesign process and think through elements of regulatory strategy, commercial strategy, intellectual property, and a reimbursement and clinical strategies, right? You're going to go through all of those different elements and develop them out for the project that you're taking forward. And in conjunction with that, you spend time both with the Stanford OTL office and learn about how you file IP through the Stanford University system, as well as get lectures and have one-on-one time with local patent lawyers who can help you with defining what the intellectual property is that you've developed around your product, and some of the strategy around how to protect that intellectual property moving forward.
Vic, can I send another one to you and then use one for us all to answer to wrap up? This one is, what do you think the expected role of MDs on the team are? As some people are talking about how they don't have medical device experience and really wonder how they can contribute to the team. I found this to be, I often wondered this as well, and then was surprised about how much I really could contribute.
So the majority of physicians who join as fellows don't have medical device experience, but the experience that we do bring to the team is that of being very familiar with the healthcare system, the hospital, how it functions, the stakeholders involved, and what some of the challenges may be for certain technologies being implemented into certain healthcare settings. Additionally, the sheer volume of medical knowledge that all physicians have can be really helpful, even if it's in an area that is not your specialty area. Just having that base knowledge can be really helpful at teaching the team certain aspects of the medical science behind certain needs or certain clinical problems that you're approaching. So my year, our clinical area was ophthalmology. And although I'm obviously not an ophthalmologist, I'm a general surgeon, my base medical knowledge was really helpful at helping the team to understand different conditions that we encountered during the clinical observation in ophthalmology.
So one of the final questions that I think would be great to answer, well, before that, there's a question about, is there a final project? And I'll just say quickly that there is definitely a final presentation based on what you've done throughout the year and the project that you're likely taking forward. And progress is tracked on a weekly basis throughout our mentors and mentorship meetings that we have. But for all of us, I think it would be helpful to answer the question, what advice do we have for everyone during the application process? You want to go first, Shreya?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. For the application process, I mean, I think it's, and you hear this a lot for advice of interviews, but it's a little bit kind of be yourself. I think that one of the challenging parts that I found actually during the interview process was a brainstorming session, which is pretty common as part of the interview process. What's interesting about that is you have no way to prepare, and I actually think it's a great exercise because it's a little preview into what your year will be like. It's a little bit, it's a little bit chaotic. It's a little bit, throwing solutions at the wall and seeing what sticks. And so I think that things like that are done purposefully to kind of bring out your character to see if this is really a good fit for you. So I think, be yourself. At the risk of sounding really cheesy.
I think that's great advice, Shreya. I would wholeheartedly agree with that. The program wants to get to know all of the applicants as people and as multi-dimensional people. So being yourself, being as demonstrating your creativity, and other aspects of your personality beyond just what can be read on a resume, I think are critical components, because the program really looks for people that have depth and compassion and, you know, a willingness to work together and as a team. And quite frankly, you know, we want fellows who will be enjoyable to work with. So, you know, the more that those traits can come across in the written application, but also in the interview, I think the better.
Yeah, let me add on to that, that no one is expecting you to come to the program with all of the skills already developed. They are understanding that you are probably coming from a very specific background, and that the skills of the biodesign program are going to help you become more well-rounded, or as a potential medical device entrepreneur and as a medical device innovator. So really what you want to do is talk about where you have experience and what you've done and how that motivates you. But then, you know, be open and clear about the fact that you don't have experience in other areas. None of us came to the program as the people that we exited the program as, and as and it, I think, was a really important part of most of our career paths. And so you know, come in knowing, like, and being able to talk about what you have and what you bring to the table, but also expect that what they're doing as they look for applicants and put teams together is looking for complementary people and pieces to put together to form really strong teams and to get you the best educational experience possible.
I'll just say, add to that a little bit. I mean, you know, we often hear Paul Yock saying that their pride of the program really is the people that come out of it, which is where I think the educational aspect of this comes in. So, you know, if you have a thirst for learning the biodesign process, that's really what's being sought.
And I don't think I could say it better than that. So Emily, do you want to wrap up a little bit? Because I know there's several questions that have come up that are very specific to specific individuals, and to be able to give them someone to contact to discuss their individual circumstances, or if they have additional questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to all of our alumni who have joined. This has been really helpful, hopefully to our watchers. If you have any questions regarding the fellowship application or things that didn't get answered today, please contact me. My email is on the website, erj@stanford.edu. Send me over an email and I'd be happy to help you out. And then Vic, I think you wanted to close out with some important dates coming up for the program, including the application deadline, which is August 16th. So make sure your entire application is completed by then. That means letters of recommendation are in, scores are uploaded. It's all got to be in by August 16th. So good luck. And Vic, do you want to close it out?
Absolutely. Again, to reiterate, the application deadline is August 16th. Notifications for interviews will go out in mid-October. The actual 2 interview days are November 8th and 9th. And notification of acceptances will be made before the winter holiday, so before December 21st. Best of luck to everyone. And again, feel free to reach out to the program if you have any questions.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.